Phonetician brotherhood of time travel. As knights of a temple to omnipotent to articulate, we dedicate this. This is humanity's hopes for the fruitful prosperity, and it is always ready. The ideas of an idea giver in love for humanity, evolves man and causes discourse amongst the power structures on multiple realms. The time traveler's first business is a material historian. He or she needs a true grasp of history. The idea giver and his ideas should be saved at all cost. No sacrifice. Find and destroy the entities that plot and attempt to destroy or hinder man or the idea giver. Notable research points: Project Montauk, Project Phoenix, Project Rainbow, Project Paperclip, Project Blue Book, Propaganda, The Philadelphia Project, The Nazi Bell, Thule Society, MKUltra, The Inventions of Nikola Tesla, The Two Muhammad in Islam, African, Aryan, Project Apollo, The Hindu War of the Gods, The Meeting in Nicaea 325 AD, and many more. Do diligent research. Amen. This led to many problems and difficulties for Chad. He began to get threatening emails from unrecognizable email addresses. He was being followed by numerous alphabet agencies within the government, and even foreign agencies were doing their best to keep track of his thoughts, actions and whereabouts. He became a part of the news cycle. He started to hear his characteristics be villainized in mass media by different individuals whom it seemed had the same intent. This is called organized stalking or gang stalking. Chad wasn't a dumb man. He knew that it couldn't be the whole government with malice towards him. He knew Chris was trying to protect him. But when he heard the president participate in the organized stalking, he knew it went much higher than anyone would believe. Chad was well versed in the conspiracy world. But times were changing so rapidly. Conspiracy theories were actually turning to conspiracy facts. Knowledge of these conspiracies weren't being dismissed anymore. Now the elite criminals were killing off the conspiracy theorists as possible witnesses that could aid in their prosecution. Chad, now too famous to hide under a rock, was looking for an off-grid cabin in the woods. Then Frankie called. Chapter 4, Frankie Franklin. Frankie had been many things to many people through his life. He was a veteran of the invasion of Iraq. He was a traveling musician and did shows across America. He had been that guy in the club for some women. He had been a devoted boyfriend to others. He had even been a business owner. He also had attained the wealth that most could only imagine. But the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Frankie's dad was an intellectual. Stories of the Philadelphia Project, the Montauk experiment and the inventions of Nikola Tesla were common dinner table talk. His father would allude at his own participation in missions with individuals whom were associated with these famous government cases. Frankie looked at this as the most exciting thing he'd ever heard. He saw parallels in the movies he saw in pop culture as a whole. His fascination with time travel made him piece together an agenda for the powers that be. At first it was an experiment in outside thinking. But the more he focused, the more probable his unlikely scenarios became. His late-night ponderings were actually in-depth investigations and rational thought. But his rational mind as a youngster couldn't fathom the possibility. Lucky for him, his subconscious was preparing him for the future. Frankie began to notice how entertainment seemed to predict future events. At first his thoughts centered on secret societies. But as time went on, he noticed singularities beyond the comprehension of men. He was forced into entertaining outside possibilities. Like angels, time travelers, aliens and demons. He remembered the games he and his friends would play as children, but he never thought that those games of make-believe play could prepare him for his future as General Franklin and his fantastic assembly. Frankie always had an incredible imagination, but he was actually one of the most logical thinkers around. Later in life this would be the key secret to his wealth. This made his make-believe play incredibly in-depth. Frankie loved studying the stars and all the new discoveries from the NASA team. The Kepler mission piqued his curiosity most. The discovery of so many planets that were at the time possibly inhabitable was enough to run his mind on overdrive. As far as Frankie's life goes, this would be seen as foreshadowing. Frankie will grow to be the first human in our timeline to step foot on these planets, or at least as far as the public knew. Thus began our timeline's manipulation of multiple paradigms of humanity's intricate history and future. Frankie Franklin and his fantastic assembly became determining factors in all aspects of human history. Sometimes seen as the very angels and demons they'd mimic as children. The most exciting part for the group was taking part in events and understanding how their present affected their history. This was a major shift in human thought and comprehension. In multiple timelines, Frankie would try and introduce advanced thinking to the people of the time. But Frankie's attempts were in vain. He could only participate in historical events. If he indeed tried to change it, it would still end in the same way it did previously. Frankie realized he had more power in the future as opposed to the past. Frankie even tried to leave clues for himself. But he didn't understand a lot of them. Even the childhood photos took a while. But he didn't instantly remember the clues. He found his only use for past time travel was observation to gain knowledge of true history. The advantage to knowing what happened, as opposed to what you were told happened, became very fruitful for the building of wisdom in Frankie. The first planet Frankie traveled to was originally named Kepler 186f. But it became known as Earthica. Earthica was a fascinating place according to the scientist at NASA. It was 1.5 the size of our planet Earth. Its oxygen was more pure than our home planet. But strikingly, its gravity was only 70% of our home planet. Estimations on vegetation and animal life were very optimistic. The median temperature was around 80 degrees and liquid water was said to be very probable. This was Frankie's first mission. Frankie found no equally intelligent life forms. But he found beautiful, majestic animal-like entities living in harmony on a heavenly, lush and fertile planet nestled in the corner of the galaxy. For this mission Frankie gained many things. He was not only promoted by Congress, but he also felt the peaceful frequency of one of the most divine planets within our eternity. This changed Frankie's psyche forever. As much as he'd try and translate his feelings in his own head, he couldn't. But when he thought of it, it made him feel something so real that religion couldn't begin to explain it. It was an energy that stayed with Frankie, and others felt this energy in the presence of Frankie. Some mistook this peaceful feeling for attraction to Frankie. But he thought it was fruits of his old witchcraft spell. It's like an ice cube in a shot glass of boiling water that never melts. Frankie emanates peace. And those in search of peace gravitate towards him. Many of humanity's heroes of folklore and religion can be attributed to the actions of Frankie and his fantastic assembly. Chapter 5, Kepler 186f Earthica. The mission fell to Frankie because of Chris. Frankie was first in his class at NASA in physical prowess and problem-solving ability. This mission was the United States' first official public mission to a planet outside of our solar system, including interstellar travel. And Frankie was in the position to choose his team. His first thoughts were the classmates at NASA with whom he shared his learning process. But he didn't know them in difficult situations. This led Frankie to a train of thought he was destined to have. Instead of looking to his contemporaries for people that matched his childhood friends, he had the idea to give them the opportunity to be trained. Frankie knew they wouldn't be ready for the Kepler 186f mission. But hopefully later missions. There wasn't any reassurance that the gang would leave their adult lives to begin a new career that they fantasized about as children. But Frankie hoped his Captain Kirk and Elon Musk fantasies would come true. And indeed they did. Frankie begins his mission a late day in May. It was moments like these that brought back the memories of past years. The make-believe play, the many missions and video game adventures. It all seemed surreal as Frankie reached outer atmosphere. His secondary propulsion system kicked in and he began to feel the bursts of air spray in rhythmic patterns. Once past the moon he could bring in his more powerful nuclear blasts. Until then he will enjoy the silence. These are the most solitude moments. These were the moments where he thought of B.B almost endlessly. It was a carefree ride through space. Mostly listening to his own music. This was a drone mission that these ships had performed many times. But Frankie was actually the first passenger. People's immune systems are affected differently. For Frankie it was a healing sensation. The photos and video feed of Kepler 186f made the place look like a virtual paradise. The oxygen levels and 70% gravity made the place seem to Frankie to be the destiny of man fulfilled. He felt like Columbus. Back on Earth Frankie was a lonely man. He had just recently split from a girlfriend he really didn't like. But he had grown accustomed to her as a means of fulfilling his human needs. He had always thought of Bibi every single long-distance run during his army career. He thought of Bibi even during the musician groupie phase. He was excited she had accepted his invitation. He had actually seen her picture on social media and couldn't get her out of his head. He knew this was a mission he had to do alone, but the thought of B.B. by his side on future missions filled him with excitement. He would marry her in a second. He just had to figure out how to approach it. There he was passing Jupiter, but all he was thinking of was a girl. Typical. He had always kept her 7th grade school picture. He even had it with him. The drone module Frankie traveled in was very primitive compared to the ships Frankie was expected to captain. This mission was to monitor Frankie's physical and mental response to space travel at different speeds and judge his molecular structure during interstellar travel. Frankie was familiar with this concept. Train harder than the actual battle. Frankie had many online classes during his travels. Many were so top secret that the subjects were only brought up off-world. He learned about alien races and how they were actually ancient Earth beings or future Earth beings that attained different levels of technology during their mental and spiritual evolution on the Big Blue Ball, and the true history and future of the American secret and public space programs. This stopped the information from travel through the electromagnetic mental grid on Earth. People with like minds and like blood feel it as random thought. But actually humans feed off of each other's brain patterns. Some of the beings like shadows actually feed on negative human emotions. It's very important to keep calm, as you wouldn't want to feed a predator. Especially when you're the prey. So obviously this experiment was also to see how Frankie dealt outside the human mental energy grid on Earth. Frankie learned the Greys are Nazi creations from World War II. Frankie also learned the Draconians were originally created to combat the Greys in the past. He learned the history of man as we know it is actually an alien entity story about DNA splicing. By the time Frankie landed on Kepler 186f, he was fully versed in the American secret space program and the trials and tribulations of his predecessors of different time periods. He now thought back to chat in the time traveler's code. And thought ... does he know? Frankie knew when he stepped foot on this majestic foreign planet, that he was the luckiest man that had ever lived. He knew 3 weeks later when the feed reached NASA there would be a huge celebration surpassing the moon mission with Lance Armstrong. He didn't know yet about the quantum-entangled satellites that transmit instantly regardless of time and space, but they were tracking every breath in real time. There he stood, Earth's first Homo sapien representative on Kepler 186f, looking at plants that seemed slightly familiar but totally foreign. He felt the reptilians from ancient Earth had done some terraforming because of some of the ecosystem. Frankie knew protocol. He fully documented the happenings of the landing. And with his helmet camera tested and recording, began to explore. The air was breathable, but Frankie carried his equipment anyways. He had landed on course and was told to explore what seemed to be a river and waterfall. He made his way through the dense soft brush towards where the map said the river was. The trees of this forest were the biggest Frankie had ever seen. Frankie saw no insects or signs of life. 20 minutes later Frankie was standing below an incredible waterfall with water that seemed half gas and half solid. Frankie used his liquid tester and identified this as H2O2. He took a sip. It was sweet and lighter than water. It made him feel great. Again he thought of BB. Frankie spent 6 months on Kepler 186f. He built a hut. He learned what to eat. He found some critters, but he only ate vegetation. He began to grow like a teenager again. He was a full 3 inches taller after the mission. From this distant place, Frankie was given the chance to time travel and assert his teachings into his childhood. He visited many different time periods of his own life. He even missed B.B so much he would follow her and just watch. Once he even found a cute puppy and even rubbed strawberries on it and allowed a childhood love story to begin. This did cause a ripple in time. Ripple in time meaning another copied reality of time travelers to interact with whose future was now changed. Once back on Kepler, Frankie was sent to leave such a peaceful habitat. But he was excited to see BB and it had worked. He got her. Chapter 6, Reunited. Frankie left before he could find out who agreed to participate. It was harder than he had imagined to leave his estate in pursuit of the final frontier. But this was his life dream. He spoke to each of his friends as if they individually were the only person he asked. He didn't want his friends to judge one another if they chose not to participate. That's the kind of guy Frankie is. This is what garners loyalty from his friends and associates. But there they all were. The whole fantastic assembly minus Frankie. Everyone's training was separate in case some of the assembly didn't qualify. Miraculously the whole crew made it. They were surprised and astonished to see one another in orientation. Duncan literally pinched himself. He had in fact dreamed of this moment since he was a child. As did the whole crew. The briefing of the group was done via Skype beginning with Frankie himself. He gave a tutorial on basic duties and functions. He also began to brief the group on the purpose of the mission as he understood. Well, as much as he could while they were still on Earth. He told them about human expansion and Earth defense systems. He had wanted more than anything to make them aware of their true history and what brought them to this moment. But he knew the Greys would be brain mapping them as long as they were still on Earth. He was aware of the Draconians, but he didn't trust them either. He was told he participated in their creation. But the stories he had actually read online made him hesitant of such an emotionally withdrawn race. He went from thinking about aliens as man's possible creators, to knowing man created the beings we call aliens. The time travel brought new possibilities and brought a more authentic reality just outside of common man's view into an enlightened perspective. Man has been submissive to outside older race entities since man gained culture. The roots of language can be found in Sumerian tales and ancient alien archaeology. The evidence is so vast that you can find it in the back of almost every museum in the world. From giant skulls to egghead beings from ancient times. Many lost technologies have been rediscovered. The more these artifacts come under scrutiny, the more the alien agenda can be comprehended. But Frankie now knew the whole story. He saw the Palladians as descendants of time-traveling Nazis. Because he was an American involved in the secret space program, he was involved with these Germanic groups and technologies. NASA had gained from Nazi scientists, and sometimes they still worked with the Third Reich, although they pledged allegiances with the Fourth Reich. The program was so big, people were taking orders from so many different places. Enemies within the system would war with influence. Blackmail and betrayal were common customs in this dark mafia society known as the Secret Space Program. Frankie mid-mission chose to accept an add-on mission. It was to delay, if not stop, the war from Revelations. He chose to lead the bear to other pastures and end the multi-thousand-year domination of the dark system. He found that humans had been brainwashed to submit to darkness through religion, government and peer pressure. He himself had to come to grips with his own brainwashing. He became enlightened. Once this process had been fulfilled, he was sent to the time needed to deliver the words in the ear of the masses to sway history in the favor of humanity's growth. And it was indeed a process. But today Frankie had to sugarcoat this message and keep the enthusiasm for his best friends. If he had known what he knew after his interstellar briefing, he wouldn't have nominated his friends. Frankie knew he was bonded to his childhood friends for life. But now they are binded in a life outside of humanity on behalf of humanity. The FBI would always visit to ask if you divulged any secrets, or had any off-world conversations here on planet. The clearance needed for these jobs ensured a lifetime under surveillance by the very people that hired you. Chris was aware of the secret technologies spying on man. These technologies have become an intricate part of the government tapestry of surveillance. They enable the blackmail and fraud. But Frankie was alone in the crew with the off-world knowledge. He couldn't wait to be off-world with the crew to have real conversations about these entities and their similarities to their elementary school make-believe play and characters from religions. But for now he just wanted to welcome them aboard. He had invited them into a dangerous life they could only escape in death. And as time travelers, death is almost impossible. But now they were proudly looking at their good friend Frankie via Skype briefing them from space. The pride each of them felt was somewhat overwhelming. B. knew she would marry Frankie then. She had heard about the waves he was making in entertainment. And she wanted him even more now than ever. Chapter 7, If You Have Ears to Hear. The adventures of Frankie and the Fantastic Assembly are vast and glorious. This is how it all began. The knowledge provided to Frankie on this mission was influenced by his future self and a future version of the Assembly. But they still asked present Frankie not to provide the information to themselves in Frankie's timeline. When they agreed upon this request, future Frankie smiled. The future Assembly glanced at future Frankie and began to laugh. Because now they knew Frankie actually had a secret from them. Not that it was as big as theirs, but hey. Present Frankie knew from this moment on they had been successful in their endeavors until that point in time. This caused Frankie additional stress. He knew he couldn't divulge future plans to his present-day friends without creating a different future. Compared to future scenarios, this isn't a huge problem. This hardest part is keeping the fact that Wendy didn't die in high school a secret. Given her present position, they wouldn't understand. From best friend to humanity's #1 enemy. This next mission will be one of the weirdest scenarios possible for a group of childhood friends. Frankie begins writing his friend's first briefing. This was the beginning for Frankie and his Fantastic Assembly. The mission to Mars would seem to be a dream. But the reality of Mars is much different than what was told to the general public. The sky was blue. The mission to Mars was only the first step to Kepler 186f. But briefing the group on the struggles already in play was a task within itself. Frankie explained the battle between the Draconians, humanity, and the supposed inhabitants of Mars. He began by telling them in layman's terms about the wars and land struggles. He explained that the Nazis in their time-traveling quest for universal dominance had created beings to help them in creating new technologies and terraforming new uninhabited planets in the interior and exterior of the Milky Way. He also mentioned the possibilities of their eventual escape from the Milky Way. He explained to them the likelihood of more human-like alien beings that were products of these beings. The Mars mission was unavoidable. From Mars, ships too large to launch from Earth could take off without the prying eyes of the public. He began to explain how the Assembly's thinking of time as linear would have to be changed into the realization of the infinite. The problems encountered by past time travelers would have to be avoided and unchanged if they expected to complete new missions. Frankie explained that the United States government had many sectors and how sometimes they opposed one another. There was a space program under the Army and another program separate in the Air Force, and even these groups had separate autonomous parts, and how Space Force didn't rule in all factions. The process began because President Hoover didn't want all information in one agency. It's called compartmentalization. But each agency grew to a point of autonomous infinite potential. There were Nazis in the U.S. government after World War II that held allegiance to their German time travel counterparts, but at this point it was beyond the Assembly to change these acts of treason against America. But when they encountered travelers from these time periods, they could make suggestions without divulging information to disturb their own timeline. Self-encounters were also not recommended unless proper permission was granted. Frankie had learned the hard way when he encountered himself from the future during one of his past travel episodes involving the dog and BB. He was granted permission to oversee his childhood training as long as he didn't make physical contact or disturb his natural timeline. He briefed the Assembly on his involvements in their childhood training, but he left out the main parts about Katie and her part in the Nazi regime. He explained how GMOs and vaccinations were actually a part of a plan to extend human life, and how time-traveling scientists had taken what was learned and used it for their own purposes. Frankie began to explain about the Ebola scare of 2014 and coronavirus 2020 and how it was an attempt at taking control and changing the history of present civilizations. He also explained how the Draconians were a creation of some of the darkest thoughts and wishes of humanity and how life on Earth had been bent and changed from its original timeline. How the governments and secret societies on Earth had taken on Draconians as their gods without understanding they were created by Nazis and had gone rogue. From there he got into the stories of angels and demons and the upside-down thought processes given to world religions. From Black Muhammad and White Muhammad to the Jesus story as a prophetic trap for a future Messiah, not a historical text. He explained how the Nazis and U.S. military had gone back in time and tried to kill all the great societies in history from Egypt, the Mayans and the Phoenicians to even greater and more ancient civilizations whose memory they had successfully erased from Earth but had stolen tech. He explained they could encounter the Draconians, the foot soldiers to this evil intent found in man. He explained the role of the Khazars in this remarkably dark scheme to replace humanity with a draconian reptilian future. He explained the history of the royal families and American government. The whole assembly was shocked. Except Chad. His training was to ready him in this history so as to keep the group on course. Chad felt a lot better knowing his perceived intuitions that he felt alone and were now validated by an old dear friend in Frankie. Chad had been on social media for years trying to ready people for these harsh realities. He had been gang-stalked by the clergy, government officials and even the entertainment apparatus. He had girlfriends and family members poisoned and always wondered why he was spared, but put through so much alienation. Now he understood. Chapter 8, Mars. The mission began like conventional space travel. From Florida to the International Space Station the assembly's mission began. But from the space station to Mars the vehicle used was somewhat out of the ordinary. It was a black triangle. At least it seemed to be black. It could have also been like a mirror reflecting the blackness of space. The speeds the vehicle reached from the space station reminded the assembly of the Star Trek television show. Upon reaching Mars a noticeable atmosphere could be seen from space. This was contrary to what they had learned in science class. The crew touched down near the equator of Mars. They were greeted by eager U.S. military personnel happy to see a group of humans from Earth new to their reality. The space program was in fact a lifetime prison of inhabitants whom felt like a human offshoot of the men and women walking the Earth. And in fact they were. There were second and third generation humans walking Mars who had grown longer and thinner due to lack of customary gravity. They considered themselves Earthlings, but it was hard for the assembly to relate to them as humans of their kind. Frankie tried to assert that these were in fact humans just like any they had known. But the physical traits made it hard for the assembly to accept. Bibi, being the lone female on the mission, garnered more attention than she felt comfortable with. Frankie found this hilarious. After Frankie handed over the crew's flight plans and paperwork, the soldiers took on a more somber attitude. They would slip and call Frankie General. Frankie didn't quite understand this slip of tongue but was intrigued by it. Frankie felt they knew more about him than he knew about himself. And he was right. Frankie alone was briefed by the unit commander, where he was told to stay in quarters for a fear of time contamination because future Frankie himself and his future crew were in the midst of a war there on Mars. And activities from time are being shuffled in matter for time encryption against rogue governments in time. He found out that he himself was the general over Mars command for the entire army and his future self couldn't be bothered with running into him or the crew at this stage in the war. This troubled Frankie. He knew he had noticed a tightness about himself when he had previously encountered his future self and he felt it was due to an emotional hardship. This was something Frankie wasn't looking forward to experiencing. He was shown a picture of his future self to reassert that he was in fact the general of Mars Command. To Frankie's amazement, he seemed in better shape and couldn't possibly be much older than he was at this time. Frankie didn't know it. But those foreign fruits made him grow 4 inches by then. When Frankie returned to the barracks where the crew was being housed, he mentioned nothing of his briefing or future position. The crew was enjoying food that was similar to Earth but much bigger and seemed to be infused with nutrients that gave them incredible energy and seemed to heal old physical bruises they had since childhood. Everyone was in a great mood. That night as Frankie laid down for his last night on Mars he found an envelope under his pillow. He opened the envelope and the letter read as follows. Dear me. I know that this message reaches you in a moment of confusion. Yeah, I remember. You're good. I'm good. A.K.A. We're good. Wendy Warren's alive and with the enemies of humanity. She's with the Draconians. They took her when we thought she died. You will have a blast on the ancient mission. Shivers smile. I needed you to know I was here. Basically so you wouldn't stay. Side note. Eve should be with Adam Angel Boy. Words hurt. You'll understand later. I know you're troubled by the news of Wendy. She's unaware of her participation in something that's evil. However, she is an intricate part of the draconian plan. Don't let the group know. They will learn in time. Pun intended. Sincerely yours. You. P.S. Don't go back and involve Wendy or you may never return to the same reality. We already messed up the lion and lamb. Which took valiant masculine protection as biblical power. Hint. Present timeline. Frankie wasn't meant to understand this yet because of the half-life deterioration period of Frankie's atoms made on his original timeline. But future Frankie kept trying. Frankie and the assembly were confined for a couple of days before they were whisked off to the launch station. At least Frankie thought. Frankie had a new sense of happiness. And thus began the tale of Frankie and his fantastic committee. Chapter 9, The Delicacy of Sacred Info. The whole crew minus Frankie was whisked away the first night on Mars as Frankie slept. They were told they would participate in a training session. The training session was a 3-day experience but would only last 4 hours in the present. The mission was the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and indoctrination to the time travel brotherhood within the government. The mission wasn't as regular as the government had let on. The crew was given a chance to converse with the being Jesus for a few minutes over the 3 days. To their surprise. He looked exactly like Frankie. Chad had been told by random strangers for years not to ask forgiveness in front of Frankie. But right now he didn't remember. They were using something like a digital translator that went from Aramaic to English, but they really found it difficult to divulge any info to the man known as Jesus. He began to ask questions and Chad replied. Why you worry about the great generation? You don't even know where you come from. Jesus found this disturbing. One night as the crew was sleeping Chad was awake. He was praying. But horribly Jesus heard and understood. Forgive me Father for I have sinned. From that moment he knew he had failed. Jesus became suicidal and even turned himself into a corrupt Roman judicial system to be killed, all the while wondering why his God had forsaken him. He had wanted to free humanity with his whole soul. When he saw a future person still asking for forgiveness he no longer felt a reason to breathe. Chad had changed history. Chad knew he had and he knew he had to make things right with Frankie in his reincarnation. But the rest may never know. Jesus saw his prayer. The crew was told in debriefing Frankie is this guy's clone. They had actually stolen the hair of Set and cloned him for a future battle. But I'll save that for later. They were not to divulge the information to Frankie that he was a Set clone. It's a weird world out there for the average guy. But it's sincerely a weird world for Frankie Franklin and his fantastic committee. He always laughed on the inside about Frankie humanity's savior but every year it made more sense. But actually walking with the disciples and seeing him look like that in an earlier incarnation he was overwhelmed. It was actually him. This was the first time Chad asked himself. So this time who's the Judas?